Thank you, everyone, for being here for what's going to be a very interesting webinar. We were very fortunate to have worked alongside of students from GW University who helped out do research and explore what the impact is of short-term housing facilities on the surrounding neighborhood. I'm going to not speak much because we have so much great material here, but I do want to toss to Jean-Michel and then perhaps Rachel, if you would like to unmute yourself and do a bit in the way of introduction, or we could just go straight to the students. But Jean-Michel, over to you to begin.
Yes, well, thank you, Chris, for organizing the webinar as usual. And thank you all for being online this afternoon for this very interesting presentation. We do hope you will enjoy it as much as we did. We enjoyed working with the students, and I want to thank the student team for doing such a great job. And then Jean-Louis and Rachel in our compliance and evaluation department for helping. I also want to acknowledge a very special volunteer in our own short-term housing facility, the Brooks, Jean Johnson, who runs our educational and arts program in the evening for children. So thank you for everything you do for us, Jean. With no further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Rachel, who will introduce the team, and then we'll have a Q&A when the students are done presenting.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Yakubashvili. I work with Jean-Louis Pita Ikambana in the Corporate Affairs Department, and we have begun a very fruitful relationship with the George Washington University's Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration over the last 2 years, where we are kind of a not placement necessarily, but a field partner for their capstone program, which is the last step that students have in their master's to public policy or public administration degrees, where they work with organizations and government agencies to conduct some sort of project that is of interest to both us as the field organization and them as students in their academic and professional interests. And this year we were lucky to be matched with 5 very amazing students from the Trachtenberg School. And we embarked on a project related to how short-term family housing programs impact neighborhoods. And the students will kind of explain like the methodology and all those things about the project. So that's the background behind it. So without further ado, I think Caroline, you'll get us started. I'm not sure who.
Okay, I'm going to share my. And apologies if I run into any technical challenges, but I think we'll have this here. Let me start this right there. Share this. Okay, I'm hoping everyone is seeing this now. And I'm going to.
Yeah, just hit present.
Perfect. All right.
Great. Thank you. It is so lovely to be here and to be able to share some of our work. My name is Spencer Nelson. I'm on the project team. I've just graduated with a Master's of Public Policy from the Trachtenberg School. If anyone else would like to introduce themselves, maybe Denasia, Caroline.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Caroline Nystrom. I am an MPA student here at the Trachtenberg School, and we are very, very happy to be here today presenting to you all. I'll pass it off to Denasia.
I'm Denasia Harden, a student in the MPA program at George Washington University, and I'll pass it off to Miriam.
Hi, everyone. I'm Miriam Arab, and I am I'm in the Masters of Public Policy program at Trachtenberg. And yeah, I'm also very excited to be here with you all today. And I think lastly is Nathan.
Yes, and hello everyone. My name's Nate, and I'm an MPA student at Trachtenberg.
Great. So we've spent a lot of time on this over the last about 14 weeks. It's been great to learn so much from Rachel and Jean-Louis and the rest of the team at Friendship Place. Could we go to the next slide, Chris? We'll try and make sure we save some time for questions and discussion at the end, but today we're going to basically cover, what was the scope of work that we were able to focus on with the short amount of time that we had on this project, some of our key research questions, what the literature has said about the impact of short-term housing on neighborhoods, some of our methodology, We did a lot of mapping, so we'll go through some of that. Some of our quantitative analysis. We also did focus groups, so we'll cover those, and then we'll talk about, how do our results can be used and how they really shouldn't be used because, of limitations in the data. And then we can just have more of a broader discussion about what we found in our analysis. And with that, I'll turn it over to Caroline. We can go over to the next slide. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, I'll be talking a little bit about our scope of work. So we were tasked with researching local opposition to housing and shelter developments, often called not in my backyardism or NIMBYism, and then conducting an analysis of the effects of short-term housing facilities on local DC crime rates. Due to perceptions from opponents of the shelters that homeless individuals bring criminal behavior into neighborhoods, the overall goal of our project was to determine what impact short-term family housing programs actually have on local crime in DC using open source data. And the findings from our project could be used to support advocacy against local opposition and NIMBYism and further dispel the negative perceptions associated with the development of short-term family housing programs in DC neighborhoods. The specific request from Friendship Place was to better understand the reality around community concerns related to opening a new homeless shelter. And this could potentially be helpful when discussing opening new facilities such as the Aston on Connecticut Avenue. We can hop to the next slide. So our work was guided by two research questions. The first was, how does the development of a short-term housing facility impact crime in the surrounding neighborhood? And then the second was, what actions can the administrators of short-term housing facilities take to minimize negative social and material impacts in surrounding neighborhoods? I'll pass it off to Denasia to tell you a little bit more about our literature review.
In this next section, we focused on research we found in previous literature on community opposition and the impacts of the development of housing facilities on crime in neighborhoods. The first section is understanding community opposition, which is more formally referred to as NIMBYism, which is the protectionist attitudes and oppositional actions towards the development of housing facilities in neighborhoods. Community opposition is rooted in place attachment, which is the process of forming an emotional connection to a place or neighborhood. Things like short-term housing facilities can be viewed as place disruption, as it disrupts familiarity, community values, and opinions, leading to community opposition. A majority of community opposition comes from baby boomers, usually high income and well-educated. Our next section examined the rationale and impacts of community opposition. The rationale from NIMBYs is that it poses threats to property values as it decreases them, neighborhood security as it may increase crime, and negative impacts on community culture. The impacts are that community opposition prolongs and disrupts the development of these shelters, directly impacting those suffering from housing insecurity or homelessness. Here we look at homelessness and crime, specifically the impact of these facilities on crime in neighborhoods. Research from Cowell and Cohen found that the opening of these shelters actually decreased crimes in neighborhoods. Specifically, in a journalistic exercise from Cowell, it was found that in San Francisco, the opening of 5 out of 8 shelters resulted in decreased or relatively stable incident reports, and other research suggests it even increased property values. Lastly, we looked at the criminalization of homelessness, where unhoused individuals are often treated as perpetrators. In local governments, in DC specifically, laws have been passed such as encampment evictions, which manage street homelessness by forcibly destroying them and making it a punishable offense through fines, arrests, or jail time. Next, I will hand it off to Nathan to discuss the methodology.
Thank you, Denasia. So when we approached our research questions, we knew that we wanted a strong quantitative foundation of statistical evidence on the potential impacts of housing facilities in DC neighborhoods. But given the team's personal unfamiliarity with the operations of these facilities and a lack of literature specific to DC housing initiatives, we sought qualitative data as well to support and elaborate upon our findings. Our intention from the outset was to use a mixed methods design that would show us if the perceptions really matched reality in the data. This sequential design relied on a quantitative analysis of reported crime data from the past decade in DC, give or take, and a subsequent content analysis of focus group responses from Friendship Place leadership staff across different facilities. We quickly learned how publicly available data is often lacking and not collected in singular sources, particularly for short-term facilities, but Friendship Place staff were very helpful guiding us through the geography of shelters and housing facilities in DC, helping us narrow down the locations of 8 facilities in particular that represented a wider range of the city's wards and several local nonprofit providers of housing services, making sure that everything wasn't exclusively Friendship Place. We looked at several family housing facilities to understand the long-term impacts most relevant to Friendship Place's services and the next facilities they're looking to open. But we understand that low barrier shelters surely have different perceptions attached to them, given the very different nature of their operations, serving those immediately in need. And that distinction is important. So there's moments where we may say the phrase shelters, but I want to preface that we're using it inclusively of short-term housing facilities. Now, quantitatively, we analyzed the average difference in monthly crimes within the control groups and treatment groups 36 months before and after the opening of each facility independently. SPSS statistical software was used to conduct a experimental difference in difference model to look at the effects kind of in the aggregate at each facility. And our approach accounted for a significant amount of time before and after the opening to capture the actual impact of those facilities' continued operations over an extended amount of time. The model will be explained in greater detail later, but in brief, I can say that we work to control for neighborhood characteristics and general trends for crime in DC to prevent bias in the model. When we conducted our focus group, the 6 leadership staff are kept anonymous in the paper, but represented a variety of Friendship Place's facility types and diverse perspectives on the issues at hand. And we've done a thematic content analysis, and I'll show you excerpts of that later as well. I'm going to pass it off to Miriam now to talk about our GIS work.
Thank you, Nathan. So as Nathan mentioned, Friendship Place did provide us with several locations of short-term family housing facilities in DC, and we did narrow down those shelters based on a variety of reasons. All of these shelters opened in the wake of the DC general closure, and they were also geographically spread around the city. They were also the only shelter in each area with our specific qualities, that being a short-term family housing facility. And using these 3 categories, we focused on 8 different shelters: the Terrell, the Triumph, the Horizon, Valley Place, the Brooks, the Aya, the Kennedy, and the Sterling. And to effectively use the shelter data in our GIS analysis, we converted addresses into latitude and longitude to locate each shelter on a map. And we needed these latitude and longitude coordinates to identify our treatment and control groups. But you can see a map on the screen that shows all the shelters in scope. You can also turn to the next slide. So in order to illustrate crime trends and hotspots, we created a clustered map of all crime incidents reported in 2023, but we also collected relevant data for each year between 2013 and 2023. But on the map on the left demonstrates crime clustered in 2023, and you can see that crime is concentrated in the center of DC near the Terrell, which is reflected in our results, as Spencer will discuss in the next slide. But our data set included crime incidents in DC from 2013 to 2023, which we obtained from Open Data DC. Crime incidents for each year were assigned to each shelter as a treatment group and a control group. The treatment group, which is the blue circle in the center on both maps on the right, illustrates crime within 1,000 feet of the shelter within 36 months before or after opening a shelter. The control group, which is the purple circle around the blue circle on both the maps, is an equivalently sized donut-shaped area and is calculated as all crimes just beyond the treatment group and after opening. Those 2 maps just show the Terrell and the Valley Place as an example and illustrate both our treatment and control groups. And with that, I'll pass it along to Spencer to discuss our results.
Thanks, Miriam. Could we actually go back, Chris, one slide? I think an important part of the hypothesis behind this analysis is that, if we were going to if we're trying to understand whether or not community concerns about an increase in crime associated with the opening of a shelter are true, then we would expect to see that the increase in the number of crimes reported in that blue circle would be significantly greater than that in the equivalently sized area in that outer purple circle. So that's kind of like the fundamental basis of the regression analysis and a lot of the work that we've done. So we wanted to make sure we also had a way that we could visualize crime trends shelter by shelter, in addition to the regression work, which is a little bit harder to visualize. And our initial data set, consisted of thousands of data points, right? So that map on the left has just 2023, but we looked at many different years. And we were lucky that, there was a really natural data set with the creation of several different short-term housing facilities after the closure of DC General. So we could actually look at, different parts of the city over time all at the same time. So we ended up summing up the total number of crimes per month for each shelter's treatment group and control group. That's the blue circle and the purple circle for the 36 months before and after opening, and that's what we use for the analysis. But that's also a little bit too noisy to show on a slide. So for visual comparison, we also created some visualizations of the average number of crimes per month before opening and after opening to showcase the change associated with each of the different shelters. So now we can go to the next slide. So this slide shows the average number of monthly crimes over that total 36-month period before and after the opening, respectively, of each of the different shelters in our data set. So the y-axis, the vertical one, is the total number of monthly crimes on average. And then there's a before-after period, that's the 36 months before, after opening, which is the 36 months after the shelter opened, respectively. And then you can see the blue line is the control group, the red line is the treatment group. So what really matters here is, what is the relative angle and slope of those curves before and after. That kind of makes you understand the impact of the opening of the shelter. And as you can see, for most of the shelters that are involved here, there's very little difference before and after the shelter opened. And in each of the treatment groups, which is the area within 1,000 feet of shelter, there was a crime that stayed effectively flat or actually declined. One major exception to this is the Terrell, as you can see in that bottom level over to the right a little bit more, in which case there was a large increase in monthly crime in the control area. So that's the area a little further away. We don't think that this is associated with the opening of the shelter in any way. That control area contains the intersection of 14th Street and U Street, which has had just a large increase in crime, and it's a lot of folks who are there late at night, so we don't think it's associated with the shelter. But the really important takeaway from this is that, as you can see, there's not an increase in the treatment group for any of these facilities of any significant amount after the opening of the shelter, showing that there's effectively very limited impact. And if you go to the next slide, we can also quantify that specific change per shelter. So this graph on the left is actually the same data as the prior slide, but it shows the average change between the treatment and control group for each shelter before and after. And as you can see, on average, there's a strong association with the reduction in crime in the treatment group relative to what happened in the control group for each shelter. The Terrell and the Triumph are both outliers there. Like I said, that it looks like there's a relative decrease in crime in the treatment group of the Terrell because of that large increase in the control group. So those are a little bit outliers. But in general, it seems pretty clear to us that there wasn't a strong increase in crime in the treatment areas. But then for robustness, as Nathan mentioned earlier, we also did a multivariable regression analysis. So that's basically a statistical analysis where we can look at all crimes across the entire data set in aggregate, and then see statistically, how likely is it that the differences that we see are by chance. And we can add in additional explanatory variables to control for other things that are outside of the data set. So we added in fixed effects to account for background changes in the crime rate. for the month and year. And we also added in fixed effects to link together the treatment and control group of each of the different shelters to basically see what is that effect in aggregate. I have that in that little box there on the bottom right. I've isolated just the most important thing, which was, in the treatment groups after opening a shelter, we found that there was, on average, holding all else equal, a reduction in crime of 1.19 crimes per month, compared to before opening and in the broader data set. So we found that was statistically significant at a p less than 0.01 level, which implies that it's very unlikely that that's by chance. Some of that is going to be impacted by those outliers like the Terrell and the Triumph there on the left, but we definitely found that it's highly unlikely that there's an increase associated with opening a shelter. We also ran it for looking at just violent crimes or just nonviolent crimes. And we found that the same finding holds for nonviolent crimes as well, but violent crimes had too small of a data set for us to really be able to look at it in a rigorous way. And with that, I'll turn it over to Caroline to talk about the focus group.
Yeah, so to further inform and contextualize our quantitative research, we also conducted a 90-minute focus group with Friendship Place staff. Topics of interest included community opposition, neighborhood impacts, and the real versus perceived relationship between the population of people experiencing homelessness and crime. Our questions focused on the experience of Friendship Place staff in developing and operating short-term housing shelters and local perceptions of crime and criminality. If we can hop to the next slide. We've highlighted here a few notable responses to our questions. In response to the question, what are the social impacts of a shelter on the neighborhoods in which it was developed? Participant responses highlighted that short-term housing created a sense of community, both for people experiencing homelessness and other community members. For those experiencing homelessness, short-term housing allows them to maintain ties to their community, while for neighbors of facilities, shelters provide an opportunity for outreach and understanding with a community that they otherwise might not necessarily understand or interact with. We also asked, how have crime incidences or the perception of crime impacted the approval and development of shelters? To which respondents highlighted that they regularly find developments derailed or stalled by NIMBY sentiments and neighborhood pushback, despite facilities' efforts to ensure good neighbor policies and challenge the perception of criminality among community members. Next slide.
In response to the question, in your experience, do crimes near shelters often involve homeless individuals served by the shelters as either victims or perpetrators? Respondents recalled that as people become older and they've experienced longer periods of homelessness, they become more disabled and have more issues. The homeless population is aging, so they are not likely to be responsible for violent crimes, but may be at fault for nonviolent crimes like public disruption, intoxication, sleeping on the street, and so on, which all can be addressed by housing as it provides unhoused individuals with a safe place. It was also noted that a lot of unhoused individuals deal with mental health issues, which actually causes them to become victims of crimes in neighborhoods. Next, Nathan will discuss the implications and interpretations of our data.
Thank you, Denasia. So, after conducting our quantitative analysis and then speaking with leadership staff during our focus group, we identified a number of limitations on our research and how our work might be built upon by Friendship Place or any other parties going forward. As for our theoretical and methodological limitations, the biggest one is that we only have reported crimes available. And we know that many incidents that impact people's perceptions of the unhoused and perceptions of crime in an area generally do not rise to the level of calling the police and having a police report drawn up, which is what we evaluated from MPD's Open Data DC portal. Likewise, our control groups, mapped as the areas beyond the immediate proximity of a facility, may not necessarily be equivalent when compared against each other. As you saw with the Terrell, one such problem is that certain control groups are further from activity centers than others or closer, such as commercial businesses or metro stations where, there is more likely to be crime in general or just reported incidents of a variety of different kinds. Our model also did not account for the size of the facilities, particularly the number of clients served and the number of beds in a facility, which could impact perceptions in the community during a development process and during normal operations, depending on the volume of clients and the visibility of those clients. Overall, we had limited time and resources to conduct effective sensitivities in the model, as Spencer discussed, such as changing our measurement of distances in the treatment control groups, and that's something we'd love to see adapted in the future. For those at or outside Friendship Place or other providers that may build on this research, we'd recommend adding varying time periods and distances in both the treatment and control areas, or utilizing synthetic control groups entirely, and performing geographically weighted regression models to account for the potential differences noted in the different control areas. It would also be valuable to include multiple types of facilities. We're only focusing on short-term housing facilities here, but low barrier shelters and more transitional facilities have fundamentally different operations and characteristics that may impact neighborhoods differently than short-term facilities do. Likewise, we found it would strengthen the validity of our results if we could identify ways to specifically associate incidents of crime with populations experiencing homelessness. But this would likely be a very intense undertaking of researching the specifics of police reports and collecting that kind of data from scratch, which just wasn't feasible with the time that we had. Next slide. Or I guess that is, yeah, sorry. When we set out on this project, Friendship's Place request was to conduct research that would inform our understanding of local opposition to the development of shelters and supportive housing facilities. Here, we sought to identify findings that we believe are the most relevant to the overall spirit of the project and the next steps that providers can take. First, we found that there's no significant association between the opening of a short-term facility and an increase in crime. Shelters mostly saw a significant decrease in reported crime, particularly nonviolent crimes, which tracks with what we have found about how homeless individuals are more likely to receive misdemeanors and other charges for behaviors associated with lacking shelter. Likewise, we found that local perceptions of homeless criminality identified in the focus group are not consistent with real crime rates around the shelters. Just as we discussed our limitations with all research, it is important to draw the line on what we can support and what conclusions we can draw. We did not assess the impact of larger shelters or facility types other than short-term facility housing, as mentioned, and we also did not tie any of the crimes to a given facility itself one way or another, or evaluate if homeless individuals were more likely or not to be victims or perpetrators of the crimes, although there is an abundance of existing literature on that subject suggesting homeless individuals are far more likely to be victims. And lastly, we did not evaluate the impacts of structural racism, anti-LGBTQIA rhetoric, and ageism on perceptions of short-term family housing or the unhoused themselves. Despite the value of understanding the discriminatory biases that may or may not underlie the psychology of local opposition, our project did not seek to measure the perceptions of crime as much as if those perceptions were founded in real trends of crime. And that's our presentation. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer those, and I'll open the floor.
Please drop your questions in the chat, I guess I can certainly start, but it's always more useful if it's organic coming from the attendees here. So I guess one question I always would have is, this is great information, this is great data to have. Any advice you would have on messaging this in a way that speaks to the general public, that to share this good news and information? What thoughts might you have on how best to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that's a great question. I think, because this is a relatively targeted analysis, it's going to be best to use this from a messaging perspective. It's going to be best to use this when you're faced with, specific concerns in which it's going to be helpful. So this is not going to necessarily be something where it would make sense to, put out a public statement about, or a press release or something. Be more, if someone has a specific concern related to, I'm worried that, opening this facility might result in some type of increase in crime, it would be useful to then talk about it in that specific context, to say, we've looked at, historically what's happened with other shelters and short-term housing facilities that have opened in DC, and we found that there was no increase in crime associated with that. And I think that's really important to make sure that the messaging is very targeted and is not, used for a way that it's a little bit too broad.
No, that makes perfect sense. Looking also in the chat here, we do have one or two questions in the chat. Okay, how can you share the results of your research with local ANCs?
Sure. So, we're kind of reaching the end here of this. But I think, Friendship Place, I think y'all are the experts here in terms of actually operating and establishing any of these places. So, we would welcome if you want to share that with the local ANC commissioners, where it's relevant. I think that would be very valuable. It's just making sure that providing the broader context.
Very good.
But yeah, we're happy for that to be shared.
No, thank you. To make it easier, I've actually opened up the chat so people can put questions directly in the chat if that's any easier for folks here. One question, are any of the shelters in the research located in the Ivy City, area? And Jean-Michel?
No.
Okay. Answers the question. Very good. Thank you.
No, we didn't have any in Ivy City. Yeah.
Another question in the chat. Can you speculate as to why crime decreased near the facilities?
Yeah, I can at least speak to what we heard in the focus groups, which is essentially that when the unfortunate truth is that when people are experiencing homelessness, they're very vulnerable. And a lot of times they become the victims of crime. Crime is perpetrated against them rather than them perpetrating crime. And the simple fact is that when people are housed, they're not on the street and therefore immediately less vulnerable to other people who might be out on the street, who could be perpetrating crime towards them. So I think that is a large part of it, is that immediately, as soon as people are receiving housing or shelter, they're quickly less vulnerable to experiencing crime.
I completely agree with what Caroline said, and I would add that while we were not able to, unfortunately, break down the types of crime by the specifics of what happened, like we didn't see if it was a homicide versus if it was a property crime and what that specifically might have been, we were able to differentiate by violent and nonviolent crimes. And we saw that there was a more pronounced effect in a decrease of nonviolent crimes compared to a decrease in violent crimes, which would suggest that, on the flip side of homeless individuals being more likely to be victims, I would also say when homeless people experiencing homelessness are charged with, say, loitering or any kind of misdemeanor charge associated with the condition of not having shelter, of having to sleep on the street, of perhaps petty theft, which was mentioned by one of our focus group participants for the basis of keeping themselves fed. Those kinds of nonviolent crimes that they are going to be hit with because homelessness is criminalized will decrease because shelter is being provided, because the precondition that is predisposed to them to doing that is taken away if they're given shelter.
Very good. Thank you. Another question in the chat, and Jean-Michel, this may be more for you. From the perspective of organizations who support the homeless, is provision of short-term housing more or less resource intensive than providing other forms of shelter? In other words, would providing more short-term housing be feasible for other support groups?
Well, certainly the short-term housing facilities are service enriched, right, which is a big part of their success. It's a relatively new model for the district, going back several years on the family side, and then places like Valley Place, which are called bridge housing facilities for singles, and the Aston we're about to open, are also service enriched. I think it's a model that's proven very effective in terms of the support we give the families. In comparison to other models, I think it serves a purpose in a continuum of care. If you want to look at the services in terms of that perspective, and I think that in terms of where we stand compared to other jurisdictions in the country, it really sets us apart from a lot of them. The progress from just shelter here, as you know, the students use shelter just because it's one word rather than short-term housing facilities, which is hard to repeat time after time. But these shelters, which still exist in the district and open at 7 a.m. and close at 7 p.m. and close at 7 a.m., serve a purpose, but they, in terms of the attention we can give somebody in a short-term housing facility, there's a real case to be made for more of them to open as we go along. And as you know, we're about to open the Aston. We can say it now; it's official. So I hope I answered the question. If there's more I need to tell you, please let me know.
Very good. Thank you. Another question in the chat was, from Susan, this is fascinating information. Is it worth sharing this information with providers in other jurisdictions? And by that, Susan, I think you mean outside of the DC area, or is this very localized? Do we think the data that you've gathered, is it something that would be applicable in other cities, do you think, or is this very DC centric?
So I'll start, and then maybe the students can chime in. I think it's worth sharing. The homeless services and fighting homelessness is a national movement, and we all learn from one another. And when the jurisdiction is doing especially well, I think it ought to share with the others
Mm-hmm.
who could start, who could create programs like this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. From the student's point of view, as a data analysis, from the data analysis perspective, is it something that carries over?
Yeah, I think it generally does. We also did a literature review of other cities as well, and it kind of depends on the methodology that you use, but we found that there is a similar decrease in other jurisdictions as well. So I think it's useful to look at it in a variety of different places. We actually didn't find anything that was specific to Washington, DC in our literature review. So that was what it was also, I think it was particularly interesting. But yeah, I think it would be useful to share with other folks.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess at this point, your data is the literature for Washington, DC.
Sure. Yeah.
And forgive me if I missed this in your, Gene Johnson, I apologize. It looks like you've got your hand up here. And so I'm going to let you ask your question, Gene, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thanks. I knew the results of your research as soon as you named your topic. Did local crime rates increase around facilities? I knew you'd say no, just from my experience in the last several years with the Brooks, getting to know the families, who comes, these, as you say, vulnerable people of families, mothers and children. So they wouldn't be perpetrating crimes in Cleveland Park. I did wonder if you did something so fine tuned as did the giant store hire more security guards based on a shelter being there? It was probably outside the scope of your research. It could be not that the residents are shoplifting, but visitors to the Brooks, people they coming to see some of the 50 families, could possibly increase shoplifting in the local stores. But I tell people about volunteering at the Brooks because it so changes their perception of the facility. I mean, I'm a gray-haired 81-year-old woman, and I say I volunteer at the Brooks. We have a learning club, and I'm in the neighborhood community garden. I tell everyone I meet there that I volunteer at the Brooks. You can see the building right from the garden. And I know it lowers their misperceptions of the homeless families. If when neighbors are going in to tutor in math and reading, it removes their fear of the unknown. And unfortunately, many people in my neighborhood have way too little experience in racial communicate in knowing Black families.
Mhm.
It's
No, thank you, Jean. Sabrina, I see your hand was up. I was actually about to ask the question you posed in the chat. Maybe you'll just want to pose that yourself about,
Yes.
well, I'll let you go. I was about to read your
Chris.
question, but you go ahead.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I'm the one that asked the question about Ivy City, and I'm also the ANC commissioner here, also community organizer with Empower DC. And we work with a lot of folks that are unhoused. Here in Ivy City, not only do we have a men's shelter, we have a transitional home for returning citizens, which is a short-term facility. And I just wanted to ask the students, what at, you did you did this research on the families, which I would assume that any short-term housing facility with families are more safer because all they want is a safe place for them and their children and until they go to the next location. But is there a reason why you did not include men's shelters and women's shelters?
So if I can interject, Valley Place is for singles, right?
Excuse me?
Valley Place is for singles, not families. There is one facility for singles. Just wanted to share that with the audience who may not know, right?
Well, on New York Avenue is the men's shelter.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
we're aware of these. Yes, of course.
Mhm.
But within the scope of the study, there was one facilities for singles. It's the one
Okay.
around in Anacostia. It's called Valley Place. Okay.
Okay, got you.
Very good.
Yeah. Sabrina, thank you for the question. I think you know, we're somewhat limited by the data set that's available. So you know, because of the closure of DC General, there were a number of different short-term facilities that were opened across the city, all roughly the same amount of time. And that roughly lines up with where the crime data is accessible from the DC Police Department. So you know, we have crime data for everything from 2008 onward. So in order to do the analysis, we were only able to look at facilities that would have opened in 2011 or later. And we wanted to make sure that we had, you know, roughly the similar type of facility that we were looking at, and then have a sufficient number of those facilities to look at. So if we had wanted to use this similar methodology, which is called difference in difference, we would have needed to have, you know, data for the well before the opening of a variety of different facilities, and just the dates and the data availability didn't work for you know, some of the lower barrier facilities like the men's shelter. You know, happy to send you you know, another study that was done that was focused more on LA that could be useful, that, you know, had some more information on lower barrier shelters.
Thank you. Another question in the chat. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to broaden it out. Did you look at the impact on the schools in the areas near the facilities for families? And if not, do you have any thoughts on data? I'm sorry, literature review that could speak to that?
We did not look at the impact of schools on the area, and we are mostly focusing on perceptions on opposition to the openings of shelters in our literature review. So that's what we focused on. But I think it would be really interesting in expanding on the research on impacts on not just perceptions, but schools and other facilities around shelters. But yeah, we did in our literature review do any research on impact of schools.
No, that could be very interesting.
Mhm.
So one question I don't think we asked, apologize if you did. Looking at the differing impacts, did you look at, what was your take on the difference between facilities in more residential areas versus more commercial areas? Or did you notice much there at all?
I can speak to the mapping because we were visualizing this through maps, we could see the difference in the crime trends visually. And you can see in the center of DC in more urban areas like around the Terrell and the other areas in that versus like the Brooks, which is I think in a more residential areas, there is less crime. And that did impact the results, as you could see in the Terrell. And I think Spencer can speak to this in a more quantitative manner, but visually it did look like there was a difference in the crimes.
There's definitely higher crime in the commercial areas compared to the residential areas. For the statistical analysis, the reason we have a treatment and control for each one is that we're trying to make sure that we have like an equivalent number. So that way, like if there's a high crime rate because it's in a commercial area for both the treatment and the control, we only look at the relative change, like as a percentage, so that even if it's a high background rate, that you hold that kind of constant, so that you don't necessarily say that the commercial ones have a higher impact of opening the shelter just because there's higher crime because it's a commercial area. Instead, you just look at the relative change in crime. But so, we primarily found that there was more crime around the commercial areas, but that there wasn't a significant increase in the crime associated with the shelter in those areas. But there's that one outlier of like the Terrell, which had a big spike in the control group. And we think that that's just, we looked at where those crimes were, and they were all concentrated on the 14th and U Street intersection.
Thank you. Another question in the chat. Do you think the pandemic affected the crime data that you were reviewing?
Yeah, so we looked at all of the crime that was happening around all of the shelters in aggregate. We definitely found that there was a pretty big spike in crime generally over that period beginning after the start of the pandemic. But we were able to effectively isolate that in the regression because that spike in crime impacts both the treatment group and the control group. So that way you're able to basically kind of block out that noise from the data set because it's affecting both. But we did find generally, just by looking at the broader crime statistics, that crime in the city, or at least reported crime in the city, did go up after the pandemic.
Thank you. I've got a question for Rachel. So you've been working with these young folks and putting together really interesting data. Did anything surprise you, Rachel, as you analyzed and took in this research?
No, not really. I was, and just I guess oppositely than surprised, I was very comforted that the quantitative data analysis matched up with the qualitative data from the focus groups and the literature review. Oftentimes DC is thought of as an outlier for many reasons. It's a small city, and it's hard to compare a city like DC to other metropolitan areas. So I mean, I guess in a sense I was surprised, but also comforted by the idea that it lines up across all the metrics that the students looked at. And if anything, I was just really impressed by the students' level of statistical analysis and sophistication in which they really did this analysis.
Thank you. I think I would have the same question for the students. You obviously you're coming in as impartial researchers. I know you must have been, but obviously you've got some thoughts coming in. Did the data surprise any of you at all, or what were your thoughts in the back of your head coming in?
I don't think the data was surprising to me. Like, I've done previous research in other classes, so when we got the results, it kind of all checked out. And then logically, to me, it makes sense that the shelters would deal with the street homelessness aspect, which is being criminalized. So it makes sense that that helped lower it.
Mm-hmm. Good
Yeah,
point.
I agree with Denasia. I think as researchers, we kind of came in with this sort of objective approach where we had to kind of accept and acknowledge the fact that at the end of it, the research could turn out in a way that we weren't expecting, or that maybe wasn't supportive of the things that Friendship Place is trying to do, which is kind of a scary thing to think. But upon finding all of our results and all of the data, it did affirm what I think we all kind of individually believed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I know it's impossible to predict the future, but from the trends you're seeing, what do you have any thoughts as to what the next year or two around each of these facilities might look like, and any, especially based on changing crime rates in the district itself? Any thoughts on that?
Really hard to speculate about that kind of thing. I mean, the only thing is really pretty clear is that there's a lot of seasonal variation in the number of crimes, and that seems like it was pretty steady.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the biggest thing that we would take away from this is that there's just not really an impact from a short-term housing facility on crime rates one way or another. And things are going to go up, things are going to go down. There's a big change in some policy in DC recently. I think that that type of change in public safety funding is going to have a much bigger impact one way or another than anything related to the opening of a facility.
Thank you. Next question, Jean-Michel, is really, I think, more for you. I mean, how do we think Friendship Place can use the research in our community outreach to build support for the Aston?
Well, I think it gives us a great basis to engage neighbors who might be reluctant to see a facility like this open in their neighborhood. It sort of puts things on paper pretty clearly. And, there's been a lot of doubt and some assumptions that were pretty negative around these facilities. So I think this is a great tool for us. We're planning to share it with DHS. We've told them that it was on its way, and messaging continues, and we need everybody's help on the call, right? With this kind of messaging, every neighbor counts. Every person who lives in DC is a constituent who votes, hopefully, and helps the district build this great system. There's a lot to be said for what we've done in DC in the last 18 to 20 years. The system was not at all as sophisticated, as developed, as on target in terms of the relation between people's needs and the models you had to offer. There are more models now, and each model is more effective based on research like this. And so this is a part of it for me. It's a great tool.
No, agreed. And I think, as we alluded to earlier in the call, when we opened the Brooks, there were certainly some community pushback and concern. And as Jean-Michel pointed out, it was other neighbors, such as Jean, who served as the best advocates. Is that folks who are your neighbors are they're the people you see as your models, right? And your role models. That if supportive neighbors are vocal, then that's great. Then that gets us gets to be the welcoming community that we're aiming for. So I would definitely make another pitch for that. I see one other question in the chat. Oh, that was you're welcome, Susan. Susan wrote thank you. Jean Bolmash wrote thank you and great presentation. We're down to the last few minutes, so I would say to Rachel or the students, any comments that you would like to close on, and then I'll close to Jean-Michel. But before I do that, I'm going to drop in the chat two things coming up. One, our next webinar will be talking about LGBTQ homelessness, and that will take place on June the, oh, forgive me, I've got to look at my calendar here, June the 4th, so 3 weeks hence. I'll drop a sign-in for that momentarily in the chat. Also, we're going to be doing a conversation at Politics and Prose this Thursday night. Chris Kennedy of our team will be interviewing an author who will be talking about his own experience as a LGBTQ young person with homelessness. So I welcome you to come on that. I will drop both of those in the chat while our students and or Rachel offer any closing comments from them, and then we'll close with Jean-Michel.
Students, you first.
Yeah, I just would want to say thank you for the opportunity to work with Friendship Places. A very rewarding chance to work with you all. I mean, our team was also great, which was pretty unique. Usually group work can be, you know, a little hit or miss. So I think that overall it was just a great project and a great cause and opportunity to work and learn so much with you all. So we just appreciate the opportunity and hope that it can be as helpful as possible in your great work. If anyone else from our team, you know, or Rachel.
I will just echo everything that Spencer just said and all the thanks to the students for all the hard work on this. For you all as community members, this is a partnership with the university that we foresee continuing into the next year. So if there are particular research questions of interest, we are welcome to that submission or feedback. Not everything is possible to study within the confines of the capstone, right? It's usually limited to the spring academic semester, so it's only, you know, effectively 3 months of time to do research. And so we have to make sure that the research questions are achievable and the project is doable in that time frame. So we may not be able to like answer all of your potential questions, but we can certainly try. So we welcome your feedback and input on that in the future.
Well, I also want to thank the students for a job really well done. This was very impressive and certainly so well presented. And the first time we heard you, I had the same impression. So thank you so much. Thank you again, Rachel and Jean-Louis, for sponsoring this every year out of the Evaluation and Compliance Department of Friendship Place. And we look forward to working with the Trachtenberg School again next year. Thank you all for supporting us. You know, we need you. So we hope to see you at events very soon at Friendship Place. Be well.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop pausing. I'm going to stop recording now.